I now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. I also wish to thank the Chef de Cabinet, Executive Office of the Secretary General, Madam Maria-Luisa Ribeiro-Viotti, for the report on the situation in the Middle East. We listened attentively to the statements delivered by colleagues, including, in addition to you, Mr. Minister, we wish to highlight and welcome the U.S. Secretary of State, Mr. Mike Pompeo, and the State Secretary of the Federal Foreign Office of Germany, Mr. Andreas Michaelis. It is no secret to anyone that presently the Middle East is encountering serious crises. These are existentialist crises for a number of states. In order to attempt to arrive at solutions to these crises, it is important not only to look forward, but also to look backward, so as to understand the errors that were made and to attempt to avoid these errors in the future. In our view, the most meaningful conclusion which we should draw from the experience of the past 2 decades is as follows. Unilateral action of any kind does not bring us closer to settling protracted and new problems plaguing the region. This situation is all the more devastating when certain United Nations member states attempt to position other member states above the law. The policies of fomenting tumult and ousting regimes that are inconvenient to certain capitals, which spawn from these actions, not only has this not led to settlement to problems in the region, but this has also created new, exceedingly dangerous problems for the region, which have led to greater bloodshed. It is clear to us, as it is to most of our partners, that the only way to extricate ourselves from the situation is to bring together international and regional efforts under the central role of the United Nations and its Security Council. It is indeed in this chamber where it is important to confirm that this premise needs to become the starting point for all of the relevant efforts and initiatives. Geopolitical engineering, intervention in domestic affairs, imposition of military solutions has led to the collapse of entire states, has caused tragedy and the death of hundreds of thousands of residents in that region. It will be no exaggeration to state that ultimately many states have fallen hostage to the short-sighted goals of external players, and they were forced to engage in proxy wars that were devastating for their national interests. Mr. Pompeo, we listened closely and attentively to your statement. I even asked my colleagues to look at it verbatim, because there is indeed a lot which hinges on your statement. A great deal depends on it. And it turned out that you used many words that have a negative connotation. Threats, challenges, deterrence, conflict, regime, limitations, restrictions, opposition, and threats. Only once did you use the word cooperation, and this was in the context of a coalition against Iran. Not once did you use the word dialogue. As we see it, those 2 words, those 2 notions underpin any and all diplomatic efforts. We also noted that you spoke in an emotionally charged way about the Persian Gulf, and you spoke at length about that. We, too, are very concerned about the situation in that region. However, the difference lies in the fact that from the very beginning, you are cobbling together a coalition against Iran, portraying that country as the main and virtually sole source of problems, a kind of empire of evil, so to speak. Moreover, of late we have observed the tensions that have been festering in the Persian Gulf, and this, in our view, these tensions are largely fomented and stoked in an artificial manner. Amid ongoing exchange of recriminations, there is a military presence that is being built up, including of extra-regional states. This creates risks of armed confrontation. Any incident is liable to spark a conflict with potentially devastating consequences. We appeal to all parties to exercise restraint, to strive to achieve de-escalation and to settle problems politically and diplomatically. This means, above all, that there's a need to eschew ultimatums, sanctions, and threats. In the light of the relevance of forging a resilient mechanism for collective security within the region on the basis of equitable dialogue, the Russian Federation has advanced and presented, including at the United Nations, a blueprint for collective security in the Persian Gulf region. And this indeed is geared towards breaking the deadlock in the conflicts, towards crafting trust building and oversight measures. We are of the view that the security system in the Persian Gulf needs to be inclusive, universal, and holistic in nature. It should include the engagement on equal footing of all states in the region with the establishment of the relevant organizational structures. The intent is for such a system to become the prologue to building a shared post-crisis architecture in the Middle East. The exclusion of any party is not acceptable. The entire scenario of cobbling together situational, temporary coalitions of mutual interests, as practice shows, lead to grim consequences alone. This one-sided initiative also includes what was mentioned today, the Ministerial Conference of Warsaw, held last February. Our approach to this event was repeatedly set out by us publicly when it was being prepared. We noted that the decisions on the format for the conduct of this conference and its agenda were taken hastily, in a concealed way, without the conduct of meaningful consultations with the UN and key regional and extra-regional players. There were contradictions in this approach, and we pointed this contradiction with being at odds with the organizers' strategy for establishment of peace in the Middle East. We explicitly said that we see therein another attempt to impose a unilateral solution for the international community, unilateral solutions to advance parochial geopolitical agendas. The outcomes of this event fully bore out those assessments. So frankly speaking, we see no added value in the efforts of the Warsaw format. Turning to Russian proposals, they can and they should be supplemented and be made a reality. These are a sort of invitation to engage in constructive dialogue on ways to achieve long-term stabilization in the Persian Gulf area. We stand ready to engage in close contact with all stakeholders, both through official channels and through socio-political and expert circles. I wish specifically to note that to advance expert-level dialogue on this issue, on the 18th to the 19th of September in Moscow, there are plans to hold an international expert-level roundtable at the Institute of Eastern Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences. Mr. Minister, we have always embraced the view that negotiations are possible under any circumstances, in any situation, provided the parties stand ready to engage in such negotiations in a mutually respectful way on the basis of the principles of international law, diplomatic practice, and courtesy. For this reason, for us, as well as for the overwhelming majority of states in the region, we cannot be satisfied by a situation where calls for Iran to sit down at the negotiating table are punctuated with direct insults and demeaning sanctions. Direct provocations and demeaning sanctions. This is an approach that one could hardly justifiably expect a response from Iran in the light of this approach. To be frank, we see no logic behind the fact that our U.S. colleagues, in breach of Security Council Resolution 2231, are now calling upon Iran to begin negotiations without any preconditions. We cannot overlook the fact that 80% of Iranian trade flow falls under the illegitimate unilateral American sanctions, which, furthermore, are also extraterritorial in nature. This is a ploy to force all parties to bow to the will of Washington. Also here, it is appropriate to recall the fact that in this way, the United States, trampling upon the norms of international law, essentially is attempting to punish those countries who are strictly complying with the resolution's provisions, the provisions of Resolution 2231. I wish to assure you, nonetheless, that even given these difficult circumstances, we will continue to seek to persuade both our Iranian and United States colleagues of the fact that it's important to step away from this dangerous precipice, to begin to engage in a settlement through civilized dialogue, which provides for an end to ultimatums, sanctions, and blackmail. Mr. Minister, as was the case many decades ago, at the heart are the problems facing the Middle East. The state of affairs in the Middle East peace process remains unsatisfactory. The situation in the West Bank is not improving, nor is the situation in eastern Jerusalem improving. There, Israel continues to engage in settlement activities and continues to demolish Palestinian buildings. This activity not only is illegal under international law, but this also constitutes one of the gravest obstacles to the establishment of a fair, lasting, and comprehensive peace in the Middle East. At the same time, there are persistent attempts ongoing to unilaterally impose alternative arrangements for a settlement. These undermine the parameters that have long ago been set out and acknowledged by the international community to resolve the Palestinian issues. The intent to create a smokescreen over seeking a lasting, comprehensive solution to this issue, in our view, is counterproductive. In the absence of promising political horizons, no economic surrogates can create the necessary conditions for full-fledged enjoyment by the Palestinian people of their national aspirations. The core principles of establishment of two states for two peoples remains a cornerstone upon which the foundation for a future stable and peaceful future for the Palestinian Israelis can be built. We call upon the leaders for not narrow political interests to be advanced, but rather the shared legal basis for Middle East settlement to be embraced. This includes the relevant Security Council resolutions, the Madrid Principles, and the Arab Peace Initiative. For our part, we intend to coordinate our action with our Palestinian and Israeli partners, states in the Middle East and North African region, and the parties to the Middle East Quartet of International Mediators. Mr. Minister, alongside the Palestinian issue, there are outstanding regional crises of a new generation, if I may put it that way. The counterterrorism operation conducted by the Russian aerospace forces of Russia and Syria has led to headway being made in the fight against terrorism. The eradication of the terrorist hotbed in Syria aligns with the interests not only of the Middle East and North Africa, but also European interests, insofar as it will lessen the low of terrorist threat stemming from the area and will lessen the flow of migrants from the area. I wish to stress that never and nowhere did we agree that terrorists can remain in Syria, anywhere in Syria, or feel themselves to be comfortable in Syria. For this reason, we call for there to be collective efforts and for double standards in counterterrorism to be abandoned. I will be frank, we continue to advocate a wide-ranging counterterrorism front. We continue to strive to establish a political settlement in Syria. We are doing this in conjunction with the United Nations under the Astana format. We advocate the unification of regional efforts. It is important now to deal with issues related to the socioeconomic recovery of the Syrian Arab Republic without preconditions. It is important to tackle issues faced by refugees and to cast aside the practice of their forced detention in third countries. The focus of our shared attention, of course, needs to be on the situation in Libya. We are of the view that assistance to Libyans in extricating themselves from the crisis can only be delivered through consolidating the positions of international players. The developments show what the consequences are of foreign military interventions. In Libya, as a result of this intervention, there has been a full, utter collapse of its statehood. We call upon all Libyan stakeholders to cooperate with the United Nations and not to advance unilateral agendas. Equally, these approaches are necessary vis-à-vis Yemen. There, all parties need to operate under the unifying basis set out by the United Nations to revive the statehood and to combat terrorism and to transition to building good neighborly relations. Mr. Minister, to conclude, I wish to stress that it will be no exaggeration to state that the alarming trends I have described have led the situation in the Middle East to a chasm, a gulf from all directions. At the same time, it is necessary to note that this is escalated through the propagandistic warfare, which is in the spirit of the grimmest chapter of the Cold War. The number of fake news reports circulated by various NGOs, which receive financing from a number of Western capitals, is astoundingly high. Unfortunately, on the basis of these mendacious and highly contentious data, unilateral decisions are taken. This not only undermines efforts to resolve conflicts, but also undermines the entire system of international relations. These are pretexts where enemies are identified, and at the same time, the real threats are being ignored, and these real threats require collective efforts being undertaken. This is an approach where we won't go far with. The earlier our Western partners understand this, the sooner together, on the basis of the aspirations of the peoples of the region, can we finally address the problems plaguing the area, both protracted and new issues. And for the moment, I wish to assure you that we stand ready to do so under any format of multilateral or bilateral cooperation or dialogue under the stewardship and the leading role of the Security Council on the basis of positive agendas, without any double standards and without concealed goals, and with, of course, the unconditional respect for the sovereignty of Middle East states and the rights and aspirations of their peoples. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for his statement.